Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Asher Marketing Podcast. This podcast is hosted by Asher Agency, a full-service partner to clients nationwide. Asher's services include media planning, creative, digital and social, website development, public relations, printing and fulfillment, and more. Anything you need to connect with your prospects and tell your story. To learn more, visit asheragency.com or contact us at hello@asheragency.com. My guest is Jason Penrod. Jason, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much for making the trip to see us and to do this live and in person. That is especially challenging for you right now because you have a new variable in your life, and that variable is a 6-month-old child.
Yes.
How's that going?
It's going well. It's, I think, for anyone that is in that situation, it's, you know, a bit of a roller coaster on about the sleep deprivation situation. Yeah. Certainly the first 3 months were rough, and then we hit like all right, we're kind of like professional parents now, and like she's actually sleeping at least 6 or 7 hours of the night, and now she's kind of like picked up this tendency of crawling in the middle of her sleep and hitting her head on the crib and then waking up and choosing violence. So
All right.
that's usually halfway through the night, 4 or 5 in the morning, she'll end up like having kind of a tiff about that. So.
Yeah. Well, my son, who is now 23, the first year of his life, he didn't sleep for more than 3 hours at any stretch. So that was, I feel your pain, and I'm glad I'm no longer in the middle of that.
Yeah, we've joked a couple of times. Both my wife and I are late 30s. I'm 38. She's 39. We had a child later in life. We absolutely agree that like that's when we would have wanted to do it in terms of like we're in a position in our career, that sort of thing. But we're also like, man, we probably would have been more equipped to like deal with only an hour or two of sleep a night in our early 20s. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it seems like you're holding up well regardless.
Thank you.
Well,
caffeine.
That always helps.
Yeah.
So, Jason, as you know, one of the things we talk about on this podcast is career path and how marketers get into the positions they're in. So I'd like to hear a little, because you have an interesting path.
Yeah.
How did you get from what you studied at DePauw as a college student to where you are today? And I know that's going to take some turns, so start wherever you want.
So I came to DePauw, which is in Greencastle, Indiana. I'm originally from Illinois. When I went into DePauw, I was laser focused on this idea that I was going to study poli-sci and I was going to graduate and become a lawyer.
Okay.
Like those were the things that I was going to do.
Was that like had your family had people in your family been lawyers, or was this just your own unique idea?
It was kind of my own unique idea. Yeah. Unlike like a lot of Midwestern kids that like just like sports, like I just seem to collect all the nerdy extracurriculars. Yeah. Was in mock trial, student government, speech and acting, theater, like all of these boxes. And I thought, you know, I think that I could do this professionally because, of course, doing it in high school
with all your friends
is
exactly like what the career will be like.
Yeah. So I just had this expectation that that's what I wanted to do. But at the end of the day, part of it was motivated by like, this will afford me like a decent or comfortable lifestyle that will allow me to have a place for creative hobbies or things like that. That was kind of the drumbeat in my mind of like, how can I be successful to facilitate like all of my creative interests that I, for whatever reason, have discounted as a professional career. Yeah. That will come back later. Okay. So I went to DePauw, and then I think about, and I was very fortunate because I've heard you talk to different lawyers that have like, once they actually got to the law firm, realized like, this is not for me. Yeah. I met an attorney, kind of job shadowed one that was in corporate law, I think about my freshman year, sophomore year, and it was easily the most depressing conversation that I've had. Like just, he clearly was on the verge of burnout. Yep. I don't really know why he entertained the conversation. he talked about 60, 70-hour work weeks and like not really seeing his family, and like it doesn't matter where you go to school, just do the work. Like it just was such a pessimistic, like I have no joy in life. And I think from what I understand, he later on actually quit his job because he just had enough of it, and just went outside of law altogether.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, this maybe not the path for me.
Well, and there's a reason, a lot of times when someone's in high school or early college and they're looking at a career path, they see these salaries and they're like, that's what I want. And you sometimes forget that comes at a cost.
Yeah.
You're going to have to work a lot more and a lot harder and a lot more stressful situation to earn that money. That is for some people. Some people work in that environment and thrive, and others say maybe something else.
Well, and I think that there's also like, particularly in the 90s, there was such a focus on like legal dramas on TV and movies, and even going farther back, like, Frank Capra films that just like romanticize this idea of a lawyer and like defending people's rights, or like you have like the William Kunslers that defended the Chicago 7 and started the ACLU.
The first celebrity lawyers,
right.
if you will,
and you're like, well, I would love to do that to defend people that need the help. And you're like, at the end of the day, most of what law is just like pushing paper. And you're like,
correct.
Is that something that you want to do?
The part they don't show in the movies.
Doesn't make for an interesting 120 minutes runtime. So I think that I was fortunate enough to come to that epiphany within my freshman year of college.
Yeah.
The problem is, like, I might not have made the best transition as far as, like, come my sophomore year, like, what is the next step? Like, what do I actually want to do? And I think for people in that position, I made the decision that a lot of people do. I kind of fell in love with a professor. His name was Bernie Botto. He was the head of the religious studies department. This is a guy who published several books, had done archaeological digs in Egypt, in Israel. He had survived a suicide bombing in the Gaza Strip in the early 90s, and just kind of like this huge, rich life that you're just kind of like, hey, this is like...
In another case where you're like, this is what it's going to be like if I follow this path.
Yeah. I would love to do this. This is amazing.
Yeah.
And I think there was a certain amount of... I went into college 2003, 2004. This is only a few years removed from 9/11. And there were so many misconceptions about religion, particularly in the terms of Islamophobia, where I was like, I just feel like I want to know more. And I started down that path, not necessarily thinking like I'm going to graduate with a 4-year degree in religious studies. It was just like, I'm going to start taking these classes and we'll see where it goes. And then it was kind of like, this is where I think that I might become a professor. Yeah. Though that's obviously not happening.
Okay. So you finish with a degree in religious studies.
Yeah.
Then what happens next?
The economy happened.
As it inevitably will. Yes.
Like the Spanish Inquisition. No one expects subprime mortgages. 2007 hits. I graduate.
Yeah.
It's already kind of a rocky job market, but it was really 2008 that like options were really limited. I came to Indianapolis, and this is also like a really weird time in terms of the job market. Like you can apply online, but it's like Career Builder and really crunchy websites. Most are still publishing job ads in like newspapers, things like that. And you probably have a parent that is telling you, well, you need to go knock on doors because that's the effective way that's not going to irritate people to give you a job. And I was just applying to anything within any metro area close to hometown, and that was Indy primarily. And the people that gave me a job happened to be Crown Hill Cemetery.
Okay, all right.
So I had kind of talked myself up into a sales job there, and it was easy for them to give me because it was a commission-only job. So it's like there's no loss if he stinks.
Yep.
So I was, for the first year of my adult career, selling funeral insurance policies, primarily in grave sites, primarily to people before the time of death, to try to like help them make those plans in advance.
So what was that like?
Awful. It was awful.
Okay.
It was a masterclass in learning that you really need to believe in the product that you sell.
For sure.
And I thought that it would be something helpful for me to navigate because I had a lot of experience with a lot of different religious affiliations. So I thought I could have those types of conversations. I thought I could be more helpful at the time of death because we were on call from time to time to help those people. But at the end of the day, you're having conversations with people that are making guilt spins that fundamentally I'm just like, you have other things, like they're gone.
Yeah.
Don't buy the mahogany casket.
Yeah.
Like, what are you doing? Yeah. And you really... that made me a terrible salesperson because it's just like, do you really need this? Or do you think that this matters?
Yeah.
So I was actively talking myself out of sales.
Yeah.
I do think that there was a great education in seeing a lot of different, really consultative sales styles that I think made me appreciate the types of people that come with, I'm here to solve a problem for you. I'm not trying to sell you something. If you buy something by solving this problem, great. If you don't, there are other people that you could work with. But for me, that was like a fight of most of what I wanted people to do is like, have you considered just cremation?
Have you considered spending less on the product I sell?
Have you considered just spending...
The product I sell on commission. Have you considered not buying it?
I know that we sell monuments, but like, don't you think that's silly?
So you're working on skills that will serve you well later, but they serve you terribly in the position you're at the time.
Right.
Yeah. So how do you move past that? What's the next step and where does that lead you to?
So indirectly, because that wasn't going anywhere and I just needed something that had kind of a consistent paycheck. I worked as a waiter for a while. That's not a significant enough story. But I ended up at a call center in sales for this organization called the College Network. Has some inherent problems if you Google them. They're kind of a for-profit education group with the initial intent of Indiana State University, all these other universities have online RN programs where you can do your clinicals remotely. What if we partner with those universities to help you get through your gen eds ahead of time? We'll do the curriculum for that so people can test or CLEP out of them. Great idea. Ahead of its curve because, this is before online learning had really become adopted at a widespread level. I think the problem is with any sort of for-profit entity, be it ITT, Chancellor, like list goes on, it may start in a place where it genuinely is trying to solve a problem by giving more of an equitable option for education. But you are tying sales numbers and statistics to recruitment efforts, and you don't have to comply to certain standards of testing and things like that. And so you start funneling in people that have no business being there, or make concessions in a way that and
you're measuring the success of the business quarter to quarter when the outcomes for the students are really going to be 5-10 years down the line, and those two things don't align really well.
And I get from an outsider perspective that the education system, the university system that we have is imperfect. But aren't you glad that there is some sort of standardization with some of these things to prevent them from taking advantage
Sure,
of you.
sure.
So I was there for 4 years. The writing on the wall kind of happened. There was a moment where our largest market was California for Indiana State University's nursing program.
Okay, interesting.
I would say 40 to 50% of our students came from there. And there was this very minor change in legislation that happened at California on how clinicals could be ran that basically made the program moot from a remote level.
Yeah.
And suddenly we lost half of our income.
Yeah.
And so there was a wave of layoffs. There was another wave of layoffs. At this point, for about 3 years, I was actually a sales manager of 40 people. I was deeply unhappy with this job. I was starting to realize how we were potentially taking advantage of people.
Yeah.
But I was also kind of in a position where it was like, I don't know what I'm qualified for.
Yeah.
And then it happened that I finally showed up one day and I was laid off.
Yeah.
And
sometimes the universe taps you on the shoulder.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I have somewhat seriously, somewhat jokingly said getting laid off from that job was the best thing that has happened to me.
For sure.
It's certainly turned my career around because I think that up until that point, I was only applying to jobs that I felt like I was ticking every box for. Like, I'm qualified for all of these things, which was not a lot because
it sounds like it's not things you've enjoyed all that much.
Right.
So it's like, hey, let's only go after the jobs that I don't like.
Yeah. And it happened that because I now was in a position that I had to apply to a ton of jobs because that's how unemployment insurance works.
Yep.
I was getting out of my own way in terms of is this something that I think I can do? If it's something that I think I could do, I'm going to go ahead and apply for it and figure out how to have that conversation in the interview.
Well, and while that's never an easy time to go through, one of the things it gives you is time. Because I think when you're working day to day, you're so caught up in just that persistent, I need to get ready for work, I need to go to work, I need to decompress from work, I need to get ready to work, I need to go to work, that you don't have time to think bigger picture about, am I in the right spot at all?
Yeah.
And should I pivot? So I don't know if that was true in your case, but that opportunity to say, okay, let me get off the treadmill and think about what else I might do.
Well, it was interesting because I got laid off the day before I actually moved from one apartment to another. And so it was just like this weird sort of, I didn't even have time to think about the downsides of my situation.
Yeah.
I immediately went into, once I moved in, going into now applying to a job is my full-time job because I don't have a job.
Yeah.
But because you're just left in this weird empty space of boxes and things like that, you get incredibly existential about what is the direction of my career and where can I go? I was fortunate enough, in kind of, it was a longer process, but I ended up through a connection from DePaul, linking me up with a company called Blue Lock, which was a tech company that served variety of different organizations in terms of cloud disaster recovery. And this was when cloud was kind of a dirty word.
Yeah.
But it was a sales position. It was cold calling, but it also had a component of doing email outreach because I think that was when we started to have this turning point of, cold calling isn't the only solution in terms of getting in front of someone and prospecting. We can also email them or have mass emails.
And some of it, I'm sure,
that.
is people are picking up the phone less, and they're opening email more.
Right.
So maybe that might be part of it as well.
Well, and primarily our audience was IT people who don't want to talk to you.
They don't want to talk to anybody.
They don't want to talk to anybody. And particularly, even if your product is something that they would want to buy, they just don't have time for you.
Sure.
They're dealing with some other problem.
Yeah. On their computer where email happens to reside as well. So,
the pivot at that job where it was okay, I'm starting to to see some pieces come together for me is initially my emails were just like, really just selling like, oh, why don't you talk to me? How about you have a conversation with me? I started to insert like more reports or things like that I thought would be valuable. That started getting some traction. But really the moment was we happened to have there was a conference that the big public speaker, like the big get of that conference was going to be William Shatner. Mm-hmm. And so I just decided, what the hell, I'm going to write an email that's going to be a lot of Star Trek puns.
Okay.
Just to see like...
So those nerd activities are now coming into your career later in life.
I guess. But I was like, I feel like when I'm sending these emails, they're just seeing like white noise.
Yeah,
just seeing like the sales pitch or like corporate speak. What if I like insert more human into it?
Yeah.
And I started like just making more jokes or finding way, not like to a point where it's disqualifying the content that I'm trying to submit to them, but at least showing some sign of like, well, there's a person behind this email and maybe you want to talk to them.
Well, it's a delivery device for the sales content, right? It's a way to package it that makes it, a little bit easier to swallow, so to speak.
Yeah. And I think that's where like, I think that was kind of it unlocked something about like content writing, blog writing, marketing writing that I didn't understand. And I would say even like a lot of marketers don't understand is that you're not trying to, in the B2B space in particular, we have this tendency of like, let's write content as if we're talking to a company. Well, you're not talking to a company. The mistake is that you are still B2C.
Yeah.
Like you are still talking to a human being that has pain and has things that make them laugh, that things that resonate with them, things like, did you pick up your kids at like 5 o'clock? You have to rush out the door to do that sort of thing. And if you can connect to those human experiences, you make better copy.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of the moment where like, well, maybe I can start doing this professionally. Maybe I happened to start like looking to see if there was some other like something else aligned to that kind of role. And there happened to be a dental software company on the south side of Indianapolis called Renaissance that was looking for, at the time, an email marketer, but essentially a content marketer to start that program. They had basically cleaned house and was looking for an entirely new marketing team. It was kind of an opportunity that I think had they been in a more mature position, I would have never gotten the opportunity. Like they would have looked for someone more tenured, but I think they were like, we're going to take a chance. So that kind of became the moment where it was like, I'm going to start doing more of this content thing. I'm going to start writing.
Okay. So you're at Renaissance for how long?
4 years.
Okay. And that's where you pivot from sales to more comprehensive marketing side.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're there for 4 years. Is Ivy Tech the next stop after that?
It was.
Okay.
It was.
So how do you end up at Ivy Tech?
So there was a couple things that kind of showed a shift in tide for me at Renaissance. One, I had kind of felt like this is as far as my career can go here.
Yeah.
I don't think that if I want to grow, I can do it here. Two, we had been acquired. I am someone that starts to see the writing on. I can kind of feel the writing on the wall of like, I don't know if they're going to evaluate that this department makes sense for them since they already have their own marketing team, and it eventually happened where the rest of the team was let go. But also there were just some obstacles that I knew the things that I was interested in terms of marketing, which was really blog writing, SEO, things like that. There wasn't as much, for whatever reason, buy-in from the executive level to do those types of things because they just didn't think that resonated with our market. And I'm like, if that's the case, then maybe this is not the job for me.
Sure.
And just happened to see the opportunity at Ivy Tech. So that was a fairly long interview process because I'm sure, because that's how we connected. My role was primarily serving our C3. I'm trying to remember the term.
So the smaller campuses.
The smaller campuses.
Smaller Ivy Tech campuses throughout the state.
Who don't necessarily have their own marketing team. So in a way, like I'm all of a sudden becoming like a marketing consultant or marketing agency. The elephant in the room is that I started about 2 weeks before the world kind of collapsed. I started.
So you start by driving to all these campuses to meet people in person and make those connections. Do you do any of that?
I did. It was on the schedule for. I had started early March, and it was on the schedule
and
for
this is early March of 2020. So that's right. Not much time to even get in the car.
This was still like, it was going on in Seattle, and that was about it. And there's like stories about Boston, and like it's kind of localized, but it's not here. And there were plans to have me go on a big campus tour and interview, like have discussions with all of the chancellors and talk about their needs and things like that. But then it was, I think, the Thursday of my second week that the first reported case of COVID was in Indianapolis, and then we were shut down. And the weirdest part was the 2 weeks after that, because, I mean, at that, from an onboarding perspective, you're like, I don't even know what to do with you because you're not quite in a position that you can help these people. So it was just kind of in limbo for 2 weeks. Of the 2 weeks that we all thought, if we flattened the curve,
we're going to go back to work in 2 weeks.
We would be going back to work. And eventually, like I started like actually being involved in things. I think what was, I guess, a benefit of the timing of me coming in and most of my experience being on the digital side was that I think in a way I was brought in to help digital acceleration or digital transformation with these campuses. It's not that it's not successful, but a lot of these campuses do or have primarily used traditional media to promote their campuses. They like print, they like billboards, they like radio, they like TV. If I can see it, then there's value in it.
And it's infinitely less complex. It's easier to understand.
You can wrap your head around it. Whereas a digital ad, it's like, well, I've not seen it, so it's not working. I'm like, but you're not the audience. So that probably would have been a more difficult conversation for me had it not been, well, that's the only choice. We only have digital.
And the 10 years of digital acceleration that happened in the course of about 3 months for everybody out of necessity. I had a client that was retail that was adamant about, we are brick and mortar. That's our point of difference. They're very smart and understand the digital world, but by choice, they were like, our point of difference is service. We categorically will not sell online. March of 2020, they called. They're like, we need a e-commerce platform. So, I think it was out of necessity. Even entities that had been resistant to digital obviously had to get there. And you coming in with that skill set, sounds like the timing was good.
And I think that there was still a certain amount of pushback in those conversations of like, the most common type of digital ad that they really embraced were kind of variations of what they already knew. Like, let's geofence, which is essentially a digital billboard for a school campus or something like that. Let's buy up all the keywords related to Ivy Tech. Well, they already know who Ivy Tech is.
Yeah.
If they're already searching for Ivy Tech, is this really valuable? It was probably a 1.5 year long journey to kind of get a couple of the campuses to really embrace this idea of, well, what if we know our nursing program is the most important thing. Let's start doing ads related that target nurses, people that are actually Googling for nursing programs in my area. Let's get in front of those people because they're the ones that don't have the answer of like, I'm looking for Ivy Tech.
Yeah.
They're just looking for...
They may not even realize Ivy Tech has a nursing program and the quality
potentially.
of the program. Yeah.
So I don't know if the lasting impact, because I was there for about a year and maybe 8 or 9 months, that those campuses continue to kind of do those things. I know that I was leaving around the time that we were all going back to campus.
Yeah.
So who knows? Maybe they're like, well, we can go back to what we were doing before.
Yeah.
But I think that there was at least a little bit more appreciation for, okay, we get digital a little bit more now.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So you're there for 1 year and 3/4-ish. Then you moved to Tech Point. So why did you decide to go to Tech Point? Let's pivot to, for those who may not know, what is Tech Point and what's your role with Tech Point?
Sure. So the official tagline for Tech Point is that we are the growth accelerator for Indiana's digital economy. That sounds very heady, but the shorthand for that is we essentially support and attract tech companies to Indiana. Tech at this point doesn't necessarily mean much because most companies in some way have some digital component. So that's kind of where we started to adopt the digital side of things.
Sure. And it's a part of the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership, correct?
Correct.
And it was originally an organization that brought together one from the IT sector, and was there another organization that was part of Tech Point in its infancy?
You're going to ask me questions from much longer time ago, and I feel like I can hear Joshua, who is the guy that has been there the longest, like screaming in my ear.
Yeah. Okay. We don't need to know the origin.
The shorthand is CICP. The parent nonprofit that I work for has a handful of initiatives that are meant to support different subsectors of Indiana's economy. Connexus supports our manufacturing and hard tech sector. Agronovis, pretty obvious what they serve. BioCrossroads serves our biosciences sector, and Tech Point serves tech. How we do that is, I think, interesting. I mean, the obvious thing would be, how do we connect companies to grants and incentive programs and things like that? But the things that we are probably most well known for are 2 programs that have actually hit their anniversary dates, pretty major anniversary dates in the next year. One is Mira and one is Extern. The Mira Awards is going to enter its 25th year next year, which is basically this big gala where the term often used is the Oscars of tech. It's where we award Startup of the Year, Scale Up of the Year, Tech Investor of the Year, Tech Educator of the Year, et cetera, et cetera. All these different awards. What happens, and certainly rewarding those types of groups is great and they get publicity for it. But the more meaningful connection is having those people all in a room. They start to make organic connections that, 10, 20, $30 million deals happen in the room when they are starting to learn about these companies for the first time at these award ceremonies. They also end up getting major clients from the publicity that they get from it. There's a Southern Indiana company called RX Lightning that primarily serves the pharmaceutical industry. They had just started 2 or 3 years ago. They do specialty medications. They had a very small amount of clients, and then they won Startup of the Year, and then they started getting major hospital contracts because of the awareness that Mira generates. The other side of it is Extern, which is hit its 10th year this year. It's basically a company agnostic internship program, summer internship program. About a decade ago, there was a recognized issue with brain drain in the state of Indiana. We have IU, we have Purdue, we have DePauw, we have Notre Dame, we have all these great universities, but if they're in tech, if they've gotten an engineering degree, they're not staying here. Yeah. They're going on to the Bay Area.
California and Austin and
And so there was this question of like, how do we have these great companies and we have great jobs and the cost of living is significantly better here than any of those places. How do we connect those people to the right companies to sell them on the idea of staying in Indiana? So the Extern program was launched to connect those students to potential internships at those companies. We recruit from all over the nation. I think it's something like 48 states we recruit from. We end up placing about 250 students over the course of the summer at area tech companies.
Wow. Yeah.
A lot of them end up staying at the tech companies that they had an internship with, but plenty just end up staying within Indy Tech or Indiana Tech.
Yeah.
They like it so much, or the connections that you make from Extern, like someone that was, in your cohort might say like, oh, well, we have an engineering role here. Why don't you come switch over to this job? So it's been a really effective way of keeping talent in the state of Indiana. There's a lot of other things that we do, but those are definitely the two big things.
So, Jason, what's your role in all that? You're obviously on the marketing side, but what are some of the things that maybe you're working on now that might shed some light on the work you do on an ongoing basis?
So I'm our digital marketing manager. I came on 2 years ago with the kind of the thought, it was associated with this initiative called the Company Hunting Initiative, which was like we're focused on drawing more companies that Indiana is not on their radar.
Yeah.
We had an SEO problem because of that. One of the many things we do is we have this publication, a web publication of the Index, which is a little bit like our version of TechCrunch or like the Indianapolis Business Journal, where we're just publishing on the stories about tech within Indiana.
Yep.
Well, if all you're publishing, all of your blog content is associated with the word Indiana, what are you going to rank well for? You're going to rank well for Indiana, Indiana Tech, Indy Tech.
Yeah. You end up with a lot of navel gazing. People in Indiana know you really well. People outside who aren't searching those keywords aren't going to find you.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think at the time that I started, 80% of our organic traffic was coming from Indiana. Most of the keywords we owned were Indiana or Indiana related. And also organic was not our primary source of traffic, which are all problems. So what I did at Renaissance is what I'm technically doing now here is about, I want to say 6 or 7 years ago, there was kind of this shift due to a couple of updates to Google's algorithm that made internal linking much more powerful. And that's kind of where the whole idea of pillar-based marketing came from, of how you win at SEO is not like publishing a lot of blog content that's just on different topics over and over again. How you win is asking the question of what would Wikipedia do? Because that is the most successful website in terms of SEO.
Yeah.
When you talk about
generally you search a term, and if it is something that's in the public consciousness, Wikipedia is going to be one of the first two hits.
Right.
Yeah.
They're either going to be the featured snippet, that little box that comes up for Google, or they're going to be number one or number two. So the question is, how do you equip your website to be more like that, to create that experience? And what's great, because we have kind of a role of being a tech educator, that pivot to providing those types of content makes a lot of sense for us. So we shifted to more of we're going to have this long form piece that's just like, what is venture capital? What is hard tech? What is ag tech? What is digital transformation? And then we're taking all these individual articles that are underneath that and linking back up to them. So they all kind of like a rising tide raises all ships in terms of SEO.
Yeah.
So it's completely transformed our metrics in terms of search traffic. We now our number one source of traffic is organic.
Yep.
Instead of being 80% Indiana, it's more like 20 or 30%. And we've actually doubled organic traffic in the course of a single year.
Oh, that's great.
So,
yeah.
And we were like the number one search result for highest paying tech jobs of 2023.
Yeah.
Biggest tech hubs in the world. We're ranked number one.
Yeah.
Et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, well, that's great. So as part of that content piece, you also are part of a podcast. So you're in an unusual seat today, being the guest. You would normally be in the seat that Nick is in.
Right.
Everyone can't see Nick, but Nick is the brains of this operation who actually does the production of the podcast. So tell me a little bit about that. What is the podcast all about? What's your role in it, and what's some of the success you've had?
Yeah, so it is very weird for me because I'm not even the person that usually interviews.
Yeah. Do you ever do the interviews?
I've done one, which has not been released yet. I interviewed Lindsay Chupkema, who is the CEO and founder of Casted, which is a podcasting platform. Yep. It felt like that was the one conversation that I felt really comfortable having.
Sure.
But ordinarily, I defer to, we have an engagement team, we have our CEO, we have a lot of different roles that have a deep bench of experience in terms of you've worked with a lot of venture capital, you've worked with a lot of different startups. They can have maybe a more organic conversation than I can.
Sure.
Where I'm like, this is all great. I'm excited to learn about this. I'm maybe not the best audience analog for that. So we started the podcast about a year and a half ago with the intent of, because of those interviews those articles that I kind of mentioned that we used to do, we did a lot of feature stories of companies based on like, hey, you had a major raise, let's talk about it. Hey, you had this huge exit. What's that deal? That sort of thing. And what happened was we were particularly during COVID, doing it via Zoom, doing it via Teams or something like that, and recording it, and then taking down the notes. And I'm like, that's, to me, redundant. Like, let's just release the video.
Yeah, for sure.
And then the transcript becomes our SEO content.
Yes.
Like, that's our supporting piece to whatever pillar we're talking about.
And a lot more efficient that way.
And a lot more efficient. We're not like, hey, let's listen to the interview, let's take nuggets out of here and turn it into this feature story and trying to craft a narrative around it. Let them do the work for you.
Yeah, for sure.
So that started along those lines. We initially, when we started to have those conversations about let's do this podcast, there were a lot, and it was coming out of COVID, so there were a lot of Zoom-based interviews that we really wanted to distinguish ourselves from. So we started doing it in person at headquarters, which we're trying to move away from a little bit because it's a huge ask for me. But we're mostly interviewing, CEOs and founders to have the conversation of like, where did you get the idea for this company? What has your entrepreneurial journey been like?
So it's almost like how I built this, but for Indiana Tech.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so when you say at headquarters, you're going to their company and you're setting up your equipment.
Right.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So Nick, it could be a lot worse. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And I mean, the thing to consider also is that while we do some really impressive things, at the end of the day, we're a nonprofit. So our equipment is pretty scrappy. Like we bought it seems impressive when you see it in person, but we bought a camera from the used section of BH Photo. We bought, our lighting kit from like the, generic brand on Amazon. Like, we made concessions where we needed to feel like we could get at least a suitable amount of equipment. The only thing that we really felt like we splurged on was probably like the audio recorder and knowing like we need a great portable recorder so we can do this well.
Yeah, and you are video first in terms of format.
Right.
Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
I think mostly just because I always kind of go from this, and I'm trying to remember the marketer that kind of, it's like a Jay Bayer thing of like, you think of content in terms of Thanksgiving dinner. Like you want to start with like this huge meal that then you're going to carve up into lunches for the rest of the week.
Yeah.
And the thing that I can start with that I can carve into multiple things is video.
Yeah.
If I start with video, then I have video, I have social snippets, I have a podcast, I have the transcript that can be a blog post.
Yeah.
If I don't start with video, if I start with audio, then I've taken one thing off the table.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great analogy. Thanks, Jay Baer. That's a great analogy. All right.
And I probably misattributed that. That's probably not him. But
Jay's a great guy, so let's just call it the Jay Baer. He probably came up with something similar.
Probably.
All right. So let's pivot to a couple quick hit questions, if you don't mind. Tell me, with the pivots you've made in your career, some of the things that you decided to shift away from and toward. What's your best lesson in all that? What's your best advice for having a fulfilling, successful career?
You know, I've listened to a few of the ones that you've done, and the answer that I would probably give is volunteering, and not like in the broad sense of like align yourself with charities or things like that, which you totally should do. But I mean more like, I think that we often say like you should network, and that's not really great advice or executable advice. It's like, hey, just go out in some space and meet people. That's not super helpful. I have found that the best way to connect with people in jobs that I want is find aligned jobs or find aligned missions like Indie Design Week or Indie Marketers that have volunteer opportunities for you to connect with, but do work. Show people that you can do the work, and that kind of gives you an opportunity to actually like prove your merit to some of these people rather than just like, hey, I connected with you at this mixer or things like that. I think also adopting that mentality towards when you're actually at work at your own job. I would never have transferred from an email marketing specialist to a content strategist if I hadn't seen the opportunity that they needed a blog writer. They needed someone to write their About Us section. They needed someone to, because they didn't hire for it. And all I said, and it's important to approach those moments with humility of like, I don't know if I'm going to be good at this, but can I try it? I think that that's a great way to, one, not be boastful about like, don't say that you can do it. Don't say that this is going to be awesome if you give it to me, because you don't know, but just be willing to volunteer with kind of the authenticity of like, I don't know if it's going to be possible, but I would really like to try content writing. Can I give it a go?
To be the person who helps the organization take that step. I love a couple things about that. Number one is the through line with what you talked about with your sales job, when it's like, hey, I want to help people. And if I can do that and sell a product, great. If I can't, I probably don't want to. And it leads to, very interestingly, a great quote from Jay Baer, who says, the difference between helping and selling is, I think the quote is, the difference between helping and selling is 2 letters, but those 2 letters make all the difference. It's when you talk about networking, what I don't like is when people talk about the forced networking and the fake networking. It's really best when it happens organically. And the best way to position yourself as a resource in someone's mind is to help them solve a problem. You and I talked before we hit record about LinkedIn. I say to people, use LinkedIn to be useful to people. Like their content, answer their questions when it's in the space you want to be known for. And they're probably going to reciprocate if you reach out for help down the line. If not, it's less likely that they will. So I think that's really good advice in a lot of different facets.
I personally, which is ironic since we're doing it, I don't like talking about myself. And it's not like I avoid it or I'm not, I don't like social situations or things like that. I just don't, I find other people more interesting, or I find certain issues or things like that more interesting to talk about than myself. And I'm sure that there are a ton of other creative types that are just like that. The way that you get around that in terms of networking is finding a way to help other people.
Well, and some of it comes down to it's not that if you speak up on a topic that you're saying, I am the world's foremost expert on this topic. You're just saying, I have a perspective on it that I'm eager to share because it might help some people. And if it doesn't, okay, great, but I'm going to share what I know. And if that's self-promotion, so be it, right? Yeah. Okay.
And I think it's also important for someone that's in their career, like you mentioned LinkedIn and helping people, and that's maybe the best way to network. I think the main thing is to not expect that relationship to be transactional.
Yeah.
Like, don't expect anything in return. Just do good, help people, and just hope that like career karma works in your favor.
Yeah.
Don't knock on their door like
like remember how I helped you 2 weeks ago. No, it's definitely not linear. And it's just the more good stuff you put out in the universe, the more good's likely to come back. It doesn't always translate as you expect. And patience is huge. There's things that it's easier for me to say this because I'm older than you are, but there's things that have come back in a good way, but it's been 10 years. And it's like, if I was impatient, I may have short-circuited that. But, hanging around getting old is a great strategy.
I mean, it's hard advice when particularly you're like really hungry for a job because you're like, I'm trying to pivot my career or I'm just trying to get a job or a foot in the door. So you really hope that it's transactional. You're like, I helped you. Can you get me in the door? But if you don't think of it that way, it'll eventually pay dividends later on of just being a good person.
There's a great quote about all of this that I really like, and it's from Robert Johnson, who's an entrepreneur and investor, and he says, make your friends before you need them. Basically, build up credit with your network writ large and trust that eventually that's going to come back. But you have to go first. If you don't, then it's going to take more time to build up that credit, if you will. All right. Second quick hit question. We turned that into a non-quick hit question, but that's perfectly okay. That's encouraged on the Asher Marketing Podcast. All right. Second quick hit question has to do with the world in which you work. What's a myth or misconception, or maybe something that's underappreciated about technology companies in Indiana, about your work as a digital marketer, whatever it is you want to address, something that you think deserves to be kind of reframed?
I think the most important thing for me is, and it ties in with a pretty big initiative that TechPoint is heading up right now, that you don't actually need a degree to get a really successful career in tech. You don't necessarily even need a degree to be a developer or an IT. It helps. It is removing a barrier for you. It makes that conversation easier because you have some evidence of your career. But there are paths to remove barriers for people that don't necessarily have access to education at an early age. There are skills first hiring programs that do adult apprenticeships and things like that. There are coding academies like 1150 that exist that can potentially get you up to speed to a point where you can get a tech career. That would be the thing that, for people that have thought that this is exclusive, this is something that I can't do, that's something that I would want people to know, is that you probably can do the job. It's just, how do you find the skills to get to that point? And it doesn't necessarily mean a degree. It can be, but it's not necessarily that way.
Well, especially in this environment where employers are really hungry for talent, especially in the tech space, especially in Indiana, there's a lot of opportunity if you're willing to learn, but it doesn't always require the path that maybe a generation ago people would take to get in that path.
And so we have a very tangible metric about it too, in terms of what opportunity there is. There is between now and 2030, there is a 41,000 headcount gap between what is considered normal college production of tech skilled workers and the roles that we estimate Indiana will need. And so if you have any minor interest in working in tech, there are potentially 41,000 jobs that would hire you in the next however many years. It's just finding a way to get a path to that job.
Yeah, and more options today than ever before if you want to do that.
Yeah.
All right, great. Okay, last quick hit question has to do with any tool or hack or tip or trick you use in your work, something that's important to you that you think other people should at least know about or appreciate. Now, I've had people say Google's really great. I've had people talk about pen and paper. So it doesn't have to be an app. It doesn't have to be tech-based. But what's something that you use that you think is important to you?
My most surprising source of content and has been super successful is talk to your customer support team. You might have this expectation that it's going to come from the sales team. It might come from a product team. But when I was at Renaissance, we were trying to think of like, how can we create a really compelling lead hook that's going to generate a lot of interest in our product. We talked to a lot of different groups, never did anything successful. And then finally we had a conversation with the customer service team to say like, well, what would be helpful in your job? Not just like, how can you better serve customers? Like, we don't even care about it being a lead hook. And they're like, hey, here's an idea. Every year we have this $200 book that everyone has to buy that is the updated dental codes. Everyone has to buy it because it's the only way you can get it. But there's only like 15 to 30 codes that are actually updated that we need to know. Make that into a PDF. Yeah. And so we did that. And we released it in January, and within a month, we got, I think, 950 inbound leads because of it. Wow. And that's something that, like, I don't think anyone would have considered having that conversation. No one would have considered. And I think it has to do with how you ask that question. It's like, we asked how we could better serve customers, and they didn't necessarily have that answer. Then it was like, well, how can we help your job and make it easier for you? And they're like, we would love a PDF that has all the CDT codes. And you're like, okay, what is that? And as they explain it, it's like, oh, this is great. Like we should start doing this. And we started putting digital ad money behind it. And it probably one of the most successful ad campaigns that we had at my time there. So don't discount your customer service reps, the people that are interacting with your customer, because they know your customer more than anybody else.
Well, what's really interesting about the way you described that, you said, here's the question we used to ask, and then the question we ended up asking. The first sounds like a question like you would ask B2B. The second is more of a B2C. Like, this is a person with pain points, so let's ask that question. See how neatly we wrap that up into a bow?
It all ties together.
When I say we, it was you. But Well, that was great. Well, Jason, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to this episode of the Asher Marketing Podcast. We'll be back next time with another great guest, and we hope you'll join us then.